All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. So first and foremost, thank you. Secondly, my name is Randy Gerber with Gerber LLC, and we are a professional service firm working with entrepreneurs to help them grow their business with purpose. And first and foremost, I do want to give a special thank you to Allison Forche and Andy Scott, as well as Kimberly. You'll hear from in a second, and helping us put this together. I'm excited to hear this topic. So far this year, we've talked about in webinars, marketing and merger and acquisition strategy, the importance of culture development, core values in small businesses, and innovation. And today we're talking about inclusive leadership. And super excited about this timely topic. I'm excited about who's talking. I'm excited about Kimberly moderating. And I'm super excited to learn from experience around inclusive leadership and why it's been a great experience. Our second webinar is Wednesday, March 24th. And we have a panel of small business owners, privately held companies, who are going to share their experiences, their insights, and candidly their obstacles of their journey of being an inclusive leader, which is very difficult for small businesses. And one of the things I talk about regularly with our clients is, as a shareholder of your company, there's all sorts of responsibilities and obstacles and people issues and opportunities. And ultimately, as a shareholder or the primary shareholder of your company, you're responsible for everything in your company. And, obviously 2020 being the year it was, it's enlightened all of us. And I think some folks view inclusive leadership as a responsibility. And today we're talking about it in the context of an opportunity, which I think is important and exciting. So we're lucky and I feel super grateful to have Kimberly Lee Miner moderate our webinar today. She's leveraged her years of experience to create her company, Bumbershoot, a boutique consulting firm that provides cultural and market insights to help business leaders strategically reposition their cultures for collaboration and inclusivity to provide a welcoming and empowering community. She's an empowering mentor and purpose-centric business leader. So Kimberly has her Bachelor of Arts degree from Temple, MBA at Drexel, and her Executive Leadership Certificate at Wharton. So from here, Kimberly, take it over, and I'm excited for what we're going to learn.
Well, thank you, Randy. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with this amazing panel. We really wanted to jump in so that we can have a lot of time to discuss the subject of the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I did want to take a few moments just to introduce the panel. I don't think there's anyone on here that you wouldn't know, but I just want to start with Alan Neville. And Alan is the SVP and Chief HR Officer, Chief DEI Officer for Metro Health in Cleveland, Ohio. We have Joanna Pinkerton, who is the President and CEO of CODA. We have Mike Kaufman, who is the President and CEO of Cardinal Health. Kyle Strickland, who is a leader with the Kirwan Institute of The Ohio State University, and Lisa Ingram, who is the President and CEO of White Castle. So we have a power-packed panel. We have a lot of questions for you and a lot of discussion, I'm sure, actually. So let's just jump in. So today is February 17th, 2021. And, I have this conversation with my children a lot, but we're still celebrating first. We're celebrating first for LGBTQ. We're celebrating first for women. And we're especially celebrating first for people of color, for Black people. And it just seems unbelievable when I'm talking to teenagers and they're like, why are we still celebrating first? And I said, well, think about this, and I'm not famous, but I started my career in 1989, and I left corporate in 2019 to start my business. And for most of my career, I was a first. And when I wasn't a first, by the time I got there, I wasn't only. And so when you think about that and you put it in relatable terms, it really makes you shake your head, like why are we still here? And I often thought about it quietly, probably more than my employers appreciate it. I did it out loud, right? But I would question that, I really questioned, do you really believe that this room of decision makers are equipped to make the decisions they need for everyone that you serve? Right? Why do you think that you know more about your customer than your customer? Do you understand the value of having diverse thought, diverse experiences, diverse faces? Like, why don't you? That was always my question. Why don't you? And so instead of having that question there, we're going to have that question here today, and we're going to talk about that very subject. So welcome to the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And thank you for joining us. I am really looking forward to the conversation. I'm extremely honored to be here. And I think it's interesting, I've worked with some of these people on boards, and Mike and I had a conversation not too long ago and said, maybe one day we'll be on a panel together. So today is that day. So I'm excited about that. So after my almost 30 years in corporate and I went out on my own, I often start my conversation with my clients in asking them if they understand the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And most people think there are different versions of those words, but there really are definitions for them. So when you think of diversity, just in the pure state of diversity is a fact. It can be a statistic, it can be a number, but it is just purely a fact. Right now, we are a diverse group of people. It's a fact. And then when you look at inclusion, diversity is a fact, inclusion is an act. It is intentional. It is something that you do that makes diversity valuable or not, right? So you have to intentionally act to make any environment inclusive. And then we get to equity. And that conversation often goes much longer than it needs to, because we have debates over equal. So is equality the same as equity? Is equity the same as equality? It is not. It is not. So equality is when everyone is given the same. Equity is when tools are created specifically so that everyone has the same opportunity. So my needs might be different than Alan's needs or Joanna's needs. But in order for me to be able to perform on an equal playing field, then those needs need to be addressed. And that's equity. So now that we've put that out there, anyone who's a part of this and is listening, if that is confusing or you want to discuss it, please make a note, because we can go back to it. But it's really important that we start at the foundation of what are the definitions that we are using for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So now that we've set the stage, we know who knows each other, we have the definitions, we're going to jump in. I'm going to start with Kyle. So Kyle, we know that over history, repeatedly, we've had what appear to be civil breakthroughs, repeatedly, for different groups, often for Black people, but for different groups over the years. Do you think that this time is different? We've heard so much about it's not a moment, it's a movement, it's different in corporate America. Do you believe that it is absolutely different? And if it is, why is it important for society to finally get it right?
Of course. So thank you so much, Kimberly, with that opening. And of course, the entire Gerber team excited to be here for today's discussion. So we are in a very different moment. We are in a racial justice movement moment. And I think the question is how we move forward. I think there are always questions about being in these similar stages of history. Every time you might have progress and then you see some sort of retrenchment of what happens. That has been the history of this country as it relates to racial justice, as it relates to social justice more broadly, where you see advancements that are made, but then you see backlash and retrenchment as a part of those advancements. That's why I think it's really important for us to understand that the moment we're in now demands transformative, bold action. We cannot think that we can only meddle and tinker around the edges and expect anything to change more broadly. Right now, we are not only facing a crisis around racial injustice, but also with the pandemic, the COVID-19, and then the economic crisis on top of that. So we are all in a moment that has been the first time in this generation of this type of moment. And because of that, we have to make sure that what we do moving forward is in spite of the backlash and resistance that will happen. And here's the fact. We cannot have this conversation without talking about the fact that on January 6th was an insurrection and coup attempt that occurred. And at the foundation of that is this ideology of white supremacy. And if we are not serious about having conversations about race and equity and inclusion without talking about the root of white supremacy and the destructive nature of that, not only for communities of color, but for all of us, regardless of our background, then we won't move forward. And so I think it's important for all of us to make sure that we have an analysis that recognizes that in our history, whether it's from slavery to Jim Crow, you had Reconstruction, but you always have this backlash, and it's usually a violent backlash. And so what happens then is people retreat. They're worried about speaking out for justice because many are in fear of their life and livelihood. And so for all of us, we have to recognize that this is not just an issue for some of us, or this is not just an issue for people of color. We all have a role to play in this. One is understanding the history of racism and race in this country, and the other is figuring out what it is that I, as an individual, and what I can do as organizations and institutions to do about it. So I think it is in our hands to do something, and I really want to stress for folks to understand that this is not a time to just return to the pre-pandemic normalcy. You know, that for many people, normal is filled with inequality and with violence and oppression and vulnerability. And so if we're to move forward, not only can we move forward in terms of our economic and health response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we can move forward towards our cultural, political, and social response to racial inequality in this country. And so I believe we're in that moment, and I hope all of us can play a role in moving us in that direction.
So Kyle, let me just follow up on something you said about transformative bold actions. So most what we see with the systemic racism and what we're seeing now, like January 6th, it clearly, well, I don't want to say clearly, but to me, it came from a point of fear. So what can you do to overcome and move people from that place of fear to maybe a place of curiosity or a place of being open to this bold transformative? Because I just feel like fear is such a strong emotion. How do we help people move past that?
It is. So you need truth telling and you need accountability. The facts are that there are those who've been fed this ideology of misinformation, and that has been weaponized with demagogues and demagoguery to basically say that diversity, inclusion, equity, that is destroying your way of life. There's this idea that the advancements of some are illegitimate or not deserving. And so as a result, there are those who are fearful and believe that, you know, they are going to be replaced, or their status or identity is going to be replaced. And so it becomes this zero-sum game when in fact, all of us, we're better when we're all doing better, right? And so what it requires is some truth telling and some honesty, but that truth telling has to be matched with accountability. The more that we allow these these flames of hate to continue on, this ideology of supremacy to continue on, what we then see is the inequality that we see. People start believing, well, that is the result of individual level outcomes. That's the result of cultural flaws or cultural deficits. That's the result of people not working hard enough and them not being responsibility, rather than putting the emphasis in place on the systems and the structures that have kept as barriers that have kept people from thriving. And so we need truth telling, and we also need accountability to say that we're not going to allow for that. The type of society that we want to be a part of is one of inclusion, is one of belonging and bringing people together. We are moving in that direction. The majority of our population is in that direction. However, there is that silence. When we say it's too divisive to talk about race, that silence then, that vacuum is filled with the most hateful voices and ideologies. And what happens then is we don't make the progress that we need to make.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a perfect segue. When we think about systems and structures and being better when we're all doing it together, right, and doing better, it really leads me to Lisa. Lisa, when you think about how it is important for all of us to do better, because then we're moving forward together, can you explain how this understanding is manifesting itself at White Castle?
Sure. So I will totally agree with Kyle's points. I do think that George Floyd in the last 6 months has really been a tipping point for many Americans to really understand that racism is a systemic, serious issue that has been going on for centuries in our country. And when you look at consumers, especially young people, they want to fix this and they don't want to hear just words. They actually want to see action, going back to Kyle's point on accountability. And they want to build relationships with brands that they trust and that share their personal commitment to a more diverse and equitable society. And as Kyle said, if you look at demographic trends, by 2050, there will be more people of diversity than not. And so that is a trend, that's a reality for businesses. And we need to be making sure that we are starting now to have a diverse culture, to have a diverse workforce, because that's what people want. They want to see in their workplace somebody that looks like them at all different levels and all different areas of the company. And lastly, there's tons of research that would suggest that, or doesn't suggest, that proves that diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous groups. And so from a business standpoint, if you want to have better results, you need to have more diversity on your team, because you're going to make better decisions, you're going to attract a better team, etc. So at White Castle, we've been around for 100 years, and we started out, and we have been in some of the same locations since the 1920s or 30s. And so we have actually seen the demographic changes around many of those castles to be much more diverse. And I'd love to say that we have had diversity in our strategy for 100 years, but that wouldn't be true. There are many pictures in our history of very white male management levels. But over the last 20 years, we have been very, very focused on diversity and making sure that we are looking at all of the opportunities to increase our diversity and to make sure that our team members feel like there's a place for them to go and there's somebody that looks like them at all different levels. And so I'm very happy to say out of our 10,000 team members, 71% of our managers are female and 53% of them are diverse. So we've really made great strides, but there are lots of other areas of the company that we can continue to focus on. But for White Castle, that allows us, when we make posts about Black Lives Matter or Gay Pride or Latino Month, we are doing that because that is who our team members are. That's who we are. It is very authentic to our brand. But as I said, we did not get there overnight. We were very intentional about it. It was definitely driven by myself and my father. We have done lots of things like diverse panels for internal promotions. When we have external candidates, we have diverse slates. We make sure that, you were talking about equity. We look at our bench, and it's a diverse bench, and we say, okay, what does each person need? And that will be very different. Some may need more public speaking. Some may need more help with financial. And it's tailored to each individual person because everybody didn't grow up the same way in White Castle. They may have gotten different opportunities. If you were white and you were male, you got some more mentoring than if you weren't. And so we're being very intentional about that. So when we do promotions, we have equally qualified candidates, no matter their gender, no matter their race, etc. And that's something that we have been working on for many years. We make sure that in the KPIs of our leaders, that diversity is included. And in all of our business reviews, we talk about diversity twice, 3 times a year. And so that's a big, big focus for us. And it's not all about the numbers. So when George Floyd happened, for us, it was really about more, how do we have more conversations about this? How do we bring people together more? So we started a thing called Shared Perspectives, where we had our diverse leaders in the company talk about how racism has impacted them. We also had what we called our Days of Understanding, which were 3 days where we brought leaders together virtually to talk about race, to talk about what it meant to be gay, just all of those different things that were uncomfortable conversations, but really allowed us to be able to learn from one another and gain a better understanding and to build empathy. A lot of people talk about why they stay at White Castle, and it's because it feels like a family, and families are empathetic. You know, they love all of the warts that you have, and they're messy, and they're loud, and they're fun. And that's really what we have tried to continue to foster over 100 years. We are not perfect. We have areas of the company where the diversity is not where I want it to be yet, but we are very, very committed to continuing to improve the diversity and make sure that every single team member feels like they see somebody who looks like them at all different levels.
So I think that's amazing. When you decided to make that move 20 years ago and to start diversifying in an intentional way, what was the case study? What did you have to prove? Like, was there a small something you had to overcome to prove that this was the right way to go? Or was it just, look, this is the right thing to do and we know it?
Well, I think it helps if you are a minority. I mean, I was a woman in a very male-dominated industry and a very male-dominated company. And I knew that when I looked at our general managers, most of them were female, or a majority of them were female, and that wasn't represented in the layers above them. And that was something that that was just one example. There were other examples related to race and ethnicity. And that's something that when I came in, I wanted to see other people in the restaurant industry, which is a very diverse industry. There are very few women CEOs in the restaurant industry, unfortunately. And we have a very, very diverse industry. So of any industry that should be able to have good representation, the restaurant industry should have. So it's recognizing that the better decisions that you're going to make are with a diverse group. And if we want to be a best place to work, and I'm assuming that everybody wants to be a best place to work. And if you want to be a best place to work, you have to be able to be innovative, you have to be creative, and you're going to do more of that if you have a diverse group of people tackling your greatest challenges. And for me, those were the two things. I wanted to see more representation in all the levels, because personally, that's what I wanted to see in our industry. And secondly, I wanted to make sure that a 100-year-old brand was going to be cool and hip and fun in another 20 or 30 years when I retire. And so I wanted to make sure that I have the best team, the smartest team, and the one that's going to make the best decisions. And that's a diverse team.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Joanna. So Joanna, as the president and CEO of CODA, which, get these numbers, so it services 562 square miles in 5 counties and provides transportation for over 19 million rides just in 2019. And we're at 2021, so that number, I'm sure it's gone up. So your employees are frontline workers for a very diverse group of customers. And when you began your company, did your company reflect the diversity of the customers, or is that something that was just a personal passion for you that you wanted to make sure happened? And what was the first act to transform your culture?
Well, thank you for that question, Kimberly. I think it's really important to acknowledge and to realize that public transportation has played a unique and a key role in social justice and equity issues in our nation for decades, long before I joined CODA. So there's been much work going on when it comes to this conversation. But to your point, when you opened our panel tonight, I was really taken by your question of why are we still dealing with this, and why are there still so many firsts in 2021 that really codified for me kind of a sentiment I held as I joined CODA in 2018. And I believe it's going to take more progress more quickly. Like what are we going to do to actually get there? So as soon as I joined, I met with our board of trustees and all of our employees, and we developed a strategic plan, and it's a roadmap to ensure that we are known as an organization that prioritizes and that actually embodies the principles of equity and diversity and inclusion at a really intense level for our community. I'm not sure most people actually understand that we are more racially segregated in our housing and our transportation and our schools now than we were in the 1960s. And, Kyle pointed it out earlier, you have to make bold moves, not just tinker around, I think he said. And we're going to have to rework our business processes in order to tackle this segregation that we have created, both racial and socioeconomic segregation. So when I think about like the role that we can play in this, when I said I began working with my board and employees in 2018, after about a year, we came up with a New Year's strategic plan. And like any strategic plan, it's got like 4 fundamental principles, but they're centered around equity, diversity, and inclusion. There was actually this debate about that being a 5th principle. And we realized that would relegate equity to checking a box. Mm-hmm. So everything is centered around the fundamental concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that means we have to use that lens with every business decision we're making. And what does that mean for someone in our business? That means we may need to build a new mobility system or repurpose existing assets under the presumption that equity was not considered when it was originally built. It may mean that we have to reach out and serve customers we've never reached before. There's a lot of sensitivity around data and interpretation of data, challenging ourselves to understand what the data and trends are telling us. And I really liked what I heard from Lisa about making sure that the room is diverse. And I insist on that at CODA. Cross-functional internal teams are made up of groups across divisions. So a single division is not allowed to make a decision on their own. They have to have a team from other parts of the operation. We don't allow manels, all men in a room. We don't allow an all-white room. And we all have a responsibility to call that out when we see it. I still remember one of the first meetings I sat in when I joined CODA, and I looked around and it was 100% white men making decisions to provide mobility services for working mothers. And I just wondered how on earth, not that they don't make good decisions, but I can assure them that I probably had a slightly different perspective than they did. And so we kind of joke about it now, but it is the norm that every person, regardless of what level you're at, has the authority to raise a red or yellow flag and say, this room is not what it should look like, and it doesn't look like our customer base. But we also have to partner with outside firms. That's really important to make sure that they're bringing us perspectives that are more diverse even than our own silo of looking at things through the mobility lens. And I do want to address, Kimberly, you asked earlier about fear.
Yeah.
I get that a lot. I suspect, maybe Lisa has as well. I've been in a male-dominated industry my entire career, and that fear holds progress back. Mm-hmm. I think it's a misconception, really common misconception, that diversity in the workplace is about taking seats away from people. And actually, my philosophy is, and you need to help people understand, we're making the table bigger. Mm-hmm. the outcomes will be bigger and they will be better. And so there will be more sharing from the more diverse ideas that are at that table. And I see that all the time where we have a return on our investment by making sure the right people are around the table, because they bring solutions to us that we never would have thought of otherwise. And during the pandemic, I'll tell you, most people got to go home, work from home, and I had 1,100 employees who went to work every single day. And there were some transit agencies that had to shut down. And we delivered service every single day during the pandemic. And it's because we had relentless cross-functional teams saying, what's our priority right now? So right now it's essential workers, it's healthcare, it's access to food. And when we streamlined our service and said, that's all you're going to get right now, we were able to figure out how to equip people to make sure they had the essential services they needed during a really difficult time. That is not business as usual. If we would have allowed, just a planning department to make that decision, they would have made it in isolation without looking at what was going on in the community. So just feel real strongly about challenging everyone to question who's at the table. And it has paid great dividends for us. I'm incredibly proud of our team. We've actually launched 4 new services in 10 months during a pandemic that have taken other cities years to develop, and our team pulled it off in a matter of 9 to 10 months. So I see where the diversity of thought really pays off.
And what you also said that's really important, and I think I want to make a sign, is that making the table bigger, right? By making the table bigger, you allow more ideas, which brought you 4 new services and a different way of thinking of what your customer needs. Right. And it's different than your strategy, but it's still part of that growth strategy. So I think that's important because people don't often hear that the table might get bigger. They actually hear the opposite. Oh, to your point, my seat might be taken away from me.
That's right.
I no longer will have the power.
I've been personally the beneficiary of some of my greatest mentors were men, as you might imagine, in the engineering field. And imagine if they would have not allowed me to be at the table with them. So I'm a really big believer in that philosophy.
I think that's awesome. I'm going to make a sign and put your name on it. I'll send them to you. Okay, Mike. So Mike, you are known in the community for being this social justice warrior and understanding the value and doing above and beyond for the team at Cardinal so that they understand. So can you just explain your journey, like how you got there? I think that would be really important for everyone to understand because beyond the investment and beyond, understanding the ROI, it really is a mindset and a passion. And I'd love for you to share, talk to us about the diversity in your leadership team and, how do you bring people along? How did you get there and how do you bring people along?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me. It's interesting. I would say that my journey just starts in general with upbringing and wanting to, treat everybody else the way I want to be treated. It's always been the way I operated. But for me, where the DE&I really took off was about 10 to 12 years ago. I asked the then CEO of Cardinal Health to run our gender equity employee resource group for women. And that really got me immersed. And I did that because I knew as a leader, the best way to grow is to put myself in an uncomfortable situation and just learn and be authentic and ask questions and be curious. And so I did that. And by running that, I can't even tell you how much that has meant to me, both truth tellers, and Kyle mentioned this earlier. I so believe in truth tellers that I surrounded myself, women in the company, women advisors outside the company to bring outside perspectives in. And I just kept having aha moment after aha moment of things that I could do better as both a person and as a leader to make life better for my wife, my daughter, the employees. That just continued my growth. And then about a year and a half ago, I would say the next component that kind of took that next leap for me was going to Montgomery, Alabama. And I had made the decision about a year and a half ago, so it was well before the George Floyd component, that I wanted to take my team down there. And so I took about 20 of us to visit the museum down there and see the lynching memorial and the Black History Museum. And that had a profound impact on me and the rest of the folks. And even though all these issues and challenges, when you go there and you stand and you listen, you just begin to really realize that while slavery may have ended in 1865, between convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, you name it, districting and everything else, it is truly systemic. And if we don't step up and do something as CEOs and as leaders and as people, it's never going to change. And so that was, I would say, the next moment, which has really continued to propel me, because like I said, I like to put myself in positions of being uncomfortable, because then I know I'm learning. And I think it's true with all of us. When you're comfortable, you're not really learning. So push yourself to go do something different. So from a payoff standpoint, as far as my team, I have 8 direct reports. 4 are women and 1 is an African-American male. So 5 of my 8 direct reports are diverse. Our board, of the 12 board members besides me, we have 4 women, 2 diverse males. So we're 50% diverse outside of myself on our board of directors. And our operating committee, which is the top 18 leaders, presidents and above, we are 8 women and 2 diverse males, so we're 56% diverse. So we have a lot of diversity at the top of the company. In fact, my 4 largest businesses right below my direct reports are all run by women. And so we have not women just in functional roles, which a lot of people might say, oh, he's probably just HR and those functions. Yeah, my HR head is a woman. But so are 4 of my large businesses. So is my chief legal officer. So is my head of strategy and business development, roles that many times are often led by males. So I think we've done at the top a good job on D&I and with the board. We still have a lot of work to do in the next levels down, and are focused on that every day. So, your question, you mentioned measurement. I'll touch about that briefly. I think measurement, you have to think about measurement in 2 buckets. There is what I call the activities bucket and the actual representation bucket. And what I mean by that is you have to measure both, because without activities, you won't improve representation. But if you don't actually truly improve representation, then you need to change your activities, because they're not really actually driving benefit. And so I think it's important to make sure, are all your employees doing unconscious bias training? Lisa and Joanne mentioned this, having diverse interview teams, compensating your people for it, attending functions like this, talking about it in town halls and meetings. So we measure all of that, and we make people's a certain percentage of their bonus tied to diversity and inclusion. But again, if you don't see representation improving, then you can't just get happy about the activities. Too many companies just measure activities and skip the representation. And you have to measure both, because my truth-telling group of African Americans and Blacks that I have, they keep telling me, only we can tell you whether or not it's really getting better. We'll tell you when it's getting better, because you can't just measure things. We need to see it. And I think that's right. And it's fair. You asked, lastly, you mentioned about bringing others along. A lot of things we've talked about. I think it's about educating folks. It's about having the right activities. It's about putting them in situations just like I had, where when you're involved in something, whether it's an employer resource group, training, or whatever, you have these, what I call aha moments, where you go, wow, I never thought about that. But then you go, now what? Mm-hmm. It's not just, aha, okay, I get it. It's like, now what am I going to do? So encouraging people to then change their behaviors and reinforce what they're doing. So those are incredibly important pieces as you're going through this.
That's, as you were talking, I was thinking of so many things. Like I was listening and then I made notes, NASDAQ, parity. Like I think we could talk about this on and on, because when I hear that we have a lot of women and we have diverse men, I often, to what level do we have the women, right? Are there women? Are there, what does it look like? Because to your point, until we see it, you know, and oftentimes especially for women of color, when it comes to gender parity, we are forgotten about, right? And so, you know, that's the next level of, well, okay, we have this, now what's next, right? What else do we need to do? So thank you for your feedback, and thank you for your example. You know, I think it's really important that we continue and that we continue to have these moments of truth telling, and that they become not just moments, but ongoing. So Alan, hi. In your role, you directly influence organizational culture across a very large medical system. So you influence, right? But unlike Mike or Joanna, since you're not in the CEO seat, how do you set the tone for that influence to become actionable?
Well, I think I have the benefit that many diversity practitioners don't have, because I lead both human resources as well as diversity. And my president and CEO, Dr. Akram Boutros, was very intentional to have HR report into diversity, which is not the norm.
No.
However, as a inclusion, diversity, and equity practitioner, more often than not, where the inequities come into play are in terms of our HR systems, our policies, and our processes. So we went there immediately, and having the ability to really look at each one of those policies and understand if there are any micro inequities or micro advantages that impact our colleagues across our system, that plays a huge role. One of the things that I've also had the opportunity to do in my role is really ensure that this is not an HR-owned effort. This is not a chief diversity officer-owned effort. This is a business imperative. And because we are a healthcare system, we're a public healthcare system, and for over 180 years, we've prided ourselves in taking care of those who are often forgotten. We serve the underserved. And quite often the underserved tend to be Black, brown, or poor white. So that has been our mission, our vision, our values since day one. And when we look at our values, 2 of our values out of the 6 are inclusion, diversity, and equity. And even more important than that, respect. And I go back to something that Kyle said earlier when we talk about accountability. And to me, this is more of a human issue. And we've gotten to a point where we've lost our humanity and we're trying to recapture it. This is not a Black issue. It's not a white issue. It's not a Hispanic issue. This is a human issue that we're dealing with. And I really think in order to have that accountability, you have to have transparency. So everything that we do, we share it internally amongst all of our 7,800 colleagues, but also externally, because we believe we have a responsibility to Greater Cleveland as a whole. So when we look at our goals that we've stated in terms of inclusion, diversity, and equity, you can find them on our intranet as well as on the internet. And as we make progress against those goals, we're going to be transparent, not only internally, but as well as externally. The other piece, and I love the fact that Mike talked about his journey down to Alabama, it really starts at the top. And for us, it started with our board. So our system board, as well as our foundation board, went through 6 hours of deep, immersive, super uncomfortable education. And my counsel to everybody on this call is, you have to understand what got us to this point, what got us to George Floyd, what got us to Ahmaud Arbery, to others, because there's a lot of stuff that has happened. And you have to lean into that discomfort, into those uncomfortable aspects of our history that you weren't taught in school. Typically, from an inclusion, diversity, and equity perspective, we gloss over the nice stuff. Okay, different communication styles, introverts, extroverts. We touch on all the easy stuff. Within our organization, we were very intentional to go directly to race. So we saw images of people having been lynched, and we shared those. Very disturbing images. We saw Emmett Till. If you don't know who Emmett Till is, Google him. We showed images of Emmett Till as a young boy before and after he was brutalized. We also showed a picture of his mom, the anguish on her face. So we've shared this imagery not to make white people feel guilty, because there's nobody on this call that did what has occurred over the last 400 plus years. However, all of us together have a responsibility to change the narrative. That's why I said it's a human issue. We got to work together to fix this. And it's going to require all of us to lean into that discomfort in order to solve this. So my next point is you have to create psychological safety. Joanna talked about sitting at the board, and she would not have had opportunities to interact with her counterparts, but they did make a way for her. It's not just about being at the table. You have to have the psychological safety to be able to speak up. Having done this work globally, understanding in certain cultures, your age may come into play where they don't want you to speak up. If you're of a certain age, you sit over in the corner with a box of crayons and a coloring book and you color until you reach a certain age, and now you have permission to speak. It's the same thing in this country in terms of being a person of color or being a woman. Just because you're invited to the party doesn't mean somebody's going to dance with you. So it's imperative that we are very intentional, and all of us have an ownership stake at this.
Well, so as having that ownership stake, and especially in medical, in the medical field and healthcare, how are you using that training to get into the community? Right now we've got people don't have access to care, disproportionately, affected by COVID.
Yeah.
Not 3% of African Americans have had vaccinations too. I think the next number is 16%.
Oh, yeah.
So that delta is huge, and I can't see it getting smaller. How as a healthcare system, how do you address that?
Yeah, so a couple realities are healthcare disparities have been in existence forever. As part of that history lesson, we need to look at the medical apartheid that has taken place in this country. Very few people know that the father of modern obstetrics and gynecology practiced on Black women who were enslaved with no anesthesia. Very few people know about the story of Henrietta Lacks. Another opportunity to really get some education around the history that's brought us here, but to the point around what are we trying to do to get the word out, it's very important for us to address things like the Tuskegee syphilis studies that were done. What we're doing is we are leveraging all of our folks within our system, and we are meeting people where they are. The fear that is in the hearts and minds of many people of color around COVID, as well as the COVID vaccine, what we have to do is present people with the facts and meet them where they are. We can't just say, hey, it's good for you. We need to truly have conversations with those patients and understand what their fears are, because some of those fears may be driven by, I don't know what's in that vaccine that you're going to inject in me. Other fears may be, was this created by the government? Why was it created so fast? How were they able to do that? We haven't been able to cure cancer, but we can come up with a cure for COVID. How are we able to do that? So we have to meet people where they are and listen to them. So I believe that empathetic listening is something that is a must do. Quite often in our organizations, we move so quickly, we hear people, but we don't listen. And if we're truly going to address a a sickness and illness that is killing Black and brown people at a disproportionate rate, we have to meet them and listen to them and understand what their fears are, provide them with the education. And I'm not going to tell you to get the vaccine. I'm going to tell you why I did. Here's what my why is, but I want to supply you with as much fact-based information for you to make an educated decision. That's what we have to do in our communities to address this. And we've also leveraged faith leaders in Greater Cleveland, because within Black and brown communities, the church still remains, regardless of what your specific denomination is or faith, spiritual homes within those communities, that's still an anchor point for many people. So we've had 92-year-old Black preachers come in and get their vaccination and explain their why. Each one of us has to explain our own individual why, not only around the vaccine, not only around COVID, but why is inclusion, diversity, and equity important to you? What's your inclusion, diversity, and equity story? And every single one of us has that. Everybody on this call at some point in time in their life has felt excluded. Might have been playing baseball. You were the last person who was picked to play in the game because you were the least athletic one. Maybe you're the one who was a little clumsy, or maybe you wore glasses. But if you can remember what that felt like, the sense of isolation, if you can remember that, if you can hone in on that memory, then you will have empathy and you will listen empathetically for people who may face that every single day. The people who you walk by in the hallway at work. They may feel alone. They may feel isolated. So we have to create an environment where people can speak up and share what's on their mind.
I mean, I think that's a very good point about empathy, because I do think we often say, oh, but at least I'm not. You know, you hear that, at least I'm not. And you think about, we've talked about race, we've talked about gender, you know, Kyle, as we think about the real spectrum of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we haven't really talked about intersectionality. How does that fit into this conversation and responsibility?
Of course. So it's critical. It's a necessary component of any sort of analysis around equity. You have to understand that everybody has different aspects of their identities, whether it comes to political, social identities, whether you're talking about race, gender, class, sexual orientation. All these different identities impact how you operate within our society, because we know within our society, there are different advantages and disadvantages that certain identity perspectives have and face. And without that analysis, then we're missing out on just the complexity of how power works, how power and oppression works. So it's not enough to just say you're talking about issues of race. We know specifically in this country as well that it's one thing about the issues faced by Black men, but also by women of color, especially seeing the systems of power and oppression and the way that works. And so it's important for all of us to recognize the privileges that we hold as a result to certain identity backgrounds that you might have, as well as what some of those disadvantages are. And if we don't have that lens, then we will never have a solution that is actually equitable. Because we are more nuanced than one identity over the other. That's why it's really important when you talk about within the civil rights movement. Obviously, a lot of focus on equality for African Americans and gaining more rights. But there was also a lot of conversation about Black feminism and what that looked like, because it's a very patriarchal system that has been made. I know that when we're having conversations about race and about equity, I know that certain advantages that I've had because of my background as a male in this society and how that is treated differently because of our system of patriarchy in this country. These analyses are critical, and it's important for us to not take that approach and lens as something to be defensive about, right? Because we have a conversation, for example, about white privilege, right? And the different privileges that folks might have. And some say, well, if you talk about the privileges that I have, then as a result, you are somehow dismissing all of the burdens and odds that I've overcome. When in fact, if you actually have a lens of intersectionality, you recognize and understand that class can also play a role in your outcomes when it comes to economics and your background as it relates to those aspects. And so what's important for us to recognize too is that when we talk about racial justice, we're talking about justice. So that means gender justice. That means all sorts of aspects when it comes to what type of society we want to see so that it is equitable moving forward. You cannot talk about racial justice without talking about economic justice. And that's why I think it's especially important too, as business leaders, as communities, that we know all aspects of someone's identity and that the life experiences that they've faced means that they might face certain disadvantages or advantages within society. And we have to have that lens and analysis for us to move forward. There's no silver bullet solution to these issues. And that's the point that I think one of the points that Alan made, which is really, really important here about humanity here. You cannot just recognize people's common humanity by expecting some of the ways that people try to talk about race and equity by just saying, well, I don't see race. This idea of this kind of colorblind analysis or society, when in fact, if we don't do that, then we are not recognizing the experiences, the lived experiences that people bring. And that's the diversity, that richness and inclusion that brings us all value as a community. One last point I'll make here. Heather McGee, the book called The Sum of Us just came out. I highly recommend this.
Okay.
One of the points about how racism hurts all of us, right? This idea that when they had to integrate public pools, rather than integrating the public pools, they just drained the entire pool. That hurts everybody. And if we don't have that approach, that's going to hurt all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for that point. And I can't wait. I pre-ordered, so hopefully my book is at my front door. But you bring up the point of a silver bullet, right? And we've spoken almost for an hour about the positive, the reason why, right? What drove you all. But it can't have been easy, right? So I just want to spend a few minutes giving the flip side. Some of the challenges. We have people on this Zoom who feel that it's too expensive. I can't afford to invest in training or what it takes to change my process or to make the table bigger. So, Joanna, when you hear that, what do you think? What's your answer to that?
So that's such an important question, Kimberly, and it's a myth that needs dispelled, quite frankly. I think the frank response to that is, how can you afford not to? Alan said it right, it's all of our responsibility. And we have a responsibility in our places of business, our neighborhoods, our places of worship, every place in the community to be questioning business as usual. And so we know, Lisa mentioned it earlier, that in the business world, there's a really strong correlation between diverse leadership and organizational performance. So that higher level of diversity, it leads to a higher value creation. So you're going to see the dividends, even if you're a small company, on the downside. But I would really question someone to think about, how can you serve your customers if you have not walked in their shoes or do not understand their needs? And if you allow your leadership and your management teams, to be dominated by one demographic, the result's going to be fewer perspectives, homogenous ideas, missed opportunities. We personally, we've made a very intentional effort to seek out talent within our organization and make sure that women and minorities are in our executive ranks. Our leadership is 77% diverse across women and people of color. That's not the case when I joined CODA just 2.5 years ago. Organization-wide, we're 72% women and minorities. And we're making these changes because we recognize that there are systemic issues which created inequities that prevented that, from being the case in the past. And I want to be really clear, we don't include women in especially, and I really appreciated Kyle's comments about sexism, we don't include women in leadership positions just to check a box. We do it because they're half of the population of the United States.
How about that?
And their voice is being represented in the services and the products that we're pushing to them. And the same holds true for minority representation. It should be equal. And so I've mentioned we're trying to hold ourselves accountable here, but when we work with other companies, particularly firms working with us, as a matter of fact, all new consultant firms that do work with us are required to go through racial equity training.
Wow.
If they're going to work on projects with us, I want to know that they are making efforts to educate their staff, just like our staff have been through racial equity training. But all of these, these activities and these processes, I want to point out, all of these things we've done haven't actually cost us a dime. It didn't require money. It was a philosophical change, and it was a commitment to equity. Education, like what Mike talked about, what he's put his team through, and visiting Alabama, the racial equity training that we do. These are commitments that you make, and it doesn't cost you anything, whether you're a small business or a big business. Yes, you can put money behind initiatives, but the thought process doesn't cost you a thing.
I have 2 signs from you, Joanna, so that's awesome. Commitments. This is fantastic. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So Lisa, we didn't really delve as deeply when we talked about it earlier, but can you just talk a little more about maybe the obstacles that you had to deal with in the past 20 years of making the changes that you've seen?
Sure. So as we looked at our organization, as I said, we're a family-owned business, and we were very patriarchal, very white. And as our diversity grew, because our customer base grew more diverse around all of our castles, we, as I said, began to realize that we needed to have that diversity represented at different layers. And what that meant was that we had white males that felt like their spot potentially was being given up. And that was a challenge because they're good team members. And we couldn't necessarily make the table bigger. So we had to have some difficult conversations about that, the value of diversity and why we believed that was going to allow us to make better decisions, because our customer base was very diverse, and we needed to have the ability to be able to have our customer base represented in all layers and in all aspects of our company. And those were some really tough conversations. And I'm proud to say, though, we have tremendous loyalty in our company. And so even those individuals that felt like, maybe my seat is not going to be there, they're still with us, and they are 100% on board with the direction that we have been moving. So we were able to convince people that this really is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do from a society standpoint, it's the right thing to do from a human standpoint, and it's the right thing to do from White Castle standpoint. But it was tough. Some of the other obstacles, when George Floyd happened, I challenged my leadership team because I was a little worried. I wasn't sure where everybody was thinking, to go out and find something that will make you feel uncomfortable. And I use the example of, I watched How They See Us, which is about the Central Park jogger case. I was so upset. I was crying. I was yelling. I couldn't believe what happened to these boys. And I felt very naive that I didn't recognize that earlier. And so it's just the little things. How can you talk to people and create more of that empathy and more of that understanding in ways that, whether it's going to Alabama or it's watching a show or reading a book or talking to somebody who's Black about racism because you haven't had that conversation before. And so those types of opportunities to push people into being uncomfortable really, for us, help build a feeling of understanding, a feeling of empathy, and a feeling of resolve that this movement that we are going to be part of, that we are going to be participating in, and that we're going to be an accelerant of is really, really, really critical. And the great thing about White Castle is we have so many diverse leaders that that's really easy for our people to do. And so having those conversations, sharing their perspectives, it allowed us to have lots of listening and really do more educating of our white team members than obviously our Black team members. And that, I think, opened people's eyes and gave people a new perspective. Because as other people have said on this panel, you're not taught about redistricting, you're not taught about redlining, you're not taught about those things in school, and they absolutely are part of our history and part of the reason why we are in this situation where we have tremendous inequity in our society. And it's time that we need to do something to reverse that. And I know that from a business standpoint, that's what I can control, and that's what I'm committed to making an impact on.
I think, that's a whole nother panel, because the whole education system, when we talk about, when I started this conversation, I talked about first and only. And there was recently, I was talking to someone that, how often do you hear of first in white history? Like how do you don't hear that, because the assumption is that, well, of course. Right. And so as you continue those conversations, I think it would be really important to call those things out and not to be afraid.
Yeah, I mean, if we just take the example in Columbus, where they took the statue of Columbus down, a lot of people didn't know about Columbus and what he had done. And so that was news to me. And there are more of those conversations that need to be discussed and talked about.
Absolutely.
To really have a good understanding.
That's right, because we all have to be curious for that to happen.
Yes.
So we're coming up on 6:30. And I know we have some other questions, but I didn't want to not ask this question of you, Mike. So the buck stops with you, right? You're the CEO, you're the guy. And so you have the power to make it happen and to hold people accountable. But not everyone in our audience has that power, and they could really want the change, but they don't have the position or the power to affect this change. We know that there are other people who doubt the value because it might affect them in a way that they're afraid or just don't know. So what are 2 or 3 thoughts that you would leave this group with that might help them overcome that hurdle or think differently, or to give themselves the permission to have the power to affect change?
Yeah, thanks. To all the CEOs out there, the buck does stop with you. It stops with me, whether you're running a really large corporation or whether you're running a small company. The buck stops with you, and for a couple reasons, right? Because if you don't say that D&I is important to you, if you don't prioritize it, if you don't let yourself be vulnerable to show where you don't really understand and learn, and if you don't fund some of these initiatives, which I thought Joanna said perfectly, which you can't afford not to fund, if you don't put the dollars forward to do this, it will die or stagnate within your company. So it really does start with that. And so you need the CEO for success. You also need the CEO to model it. Because if the CEO says one thing, but then does another, because I've seen it. I've seen CEOs say it's important to them, and then they don't show up to any meetings. They don't actually surround themselves with any truth tellers. And so they give money to the Urban League or to some initiative, but they don't actually then do anything. And those are, they're a short-term type of a thing to make you feel good. So you have to model it, because employees will think it's the flavor of the month. I have heard employees for a long time ask the questions, is this just the flavor of the month? It's just the flavor of the month. And it's taken a long time for me. 3 years I've been CEO. And I talked about it in the very first meeting. And it took over a year, 2 years for some people to go, you know what, this is not Mike's flavor of the month. Like, he's really committed to it. And I'm okay with that, but you got to stick to it. So I would say you got to understand your responsibility, and you got to stick to it. I also would say that everyone actually can make a difference. So the CEO is just one person. If the rest of the leadership team and people aren't engaged in this, then it still will fail, because I'm not in the meeting when some hiring manager that's 7 levels below me is getting ready to make a hiring decision and didn't have a diverse slate, didn't have a diverse panel, didn't, do those things. So if people aren't calling that out and buying in all the way down, you're not really going to make progress. So everyone, even if no one reports to you and you're an individual contributor, you need to speak out when you see these things happen in your company. You need to go to people and let them know, because I know within Cardinal, we're not perfect, but if people don't tell me what's going on, I can't do anything about it. So I think everyone can, make a difference here. So, I would, and I'll just end with this thought from my end is that, that we talked a little bit about the business case, and some people want to argue it and all this, is it real and tainted and this, and I believe the data, I believe it is real, but just think about it from this way. Let's just make it personal. If you had to wake up every morning and you had to spend time thinking about how you were going to fix your hair because you didn't want to look too ethnic when you came in the office place, if you didn't want to mention your partner because they happen to be the same sex as you, and you burned up all kinds of time on those types of things versus just coming to work and bringing 100% of yourself to work every day, can you really truly tell me that you wouldn't be more productive, you wouldn't be happier, and your company wouldn't do better? So to me, it's just common sense. When somebody can bring 100% of themselves, then the company benefits and the person benefits.
Thank you. That was outstanding. Thank you. Of course, that we could talk about the Crown Act, but we don't have time. But I think that this has been an amazing conversation. We do have one question, and I'm just going to throw it out there, and whoever wants to answer it. But we did have a question. One of our attendees wanted to know, how have interview questions or techniques changed to include diverse applicants?
So one of the things that we've done within Metro Health is we've looked at all of our job descriptions, because we realized that they were originally written with some bias in them, which resulted in those micro inequities. So rather than require a degree for every role, obviously if you're a physician or a nurse, you need to have a degree. But there's so many roles within healthcare where we've decided to go with degree and or equivalent experience, and not just have those words, actually practice that. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, regardless of your business, if you're looking for a manager, do you want somebody who has management experience, or are you just going to take somebody who has a bachelor's degree, then got their master's, and because they had to pay a lot of money for their master's, they're looking for a management level job having never managed people? Which one do you want to put your chips in? Which bucket? So what we've realized is that has excluded a number of people because they may not have that degree. And what we do is we point them towards the plenty of dollars that we spend on tuition reimbursement. So we're still going to encourage you to get that certification or that piece of paper, but in no way, shape, or form should that be career limiting.
Love it. That's great. Thank you very much. So we are at 6:30. And so I just want to thank you all. This has been wonderful. And if we can do it again, I hope so soon, because there's so many things that we could talk about. So thank you for your time. And I'm going to hand it over to Randy to take us home.
Well, thank you again. And I neglected, unfortunately, to thank our panelists in the beginning, and I should have. So thank you. A couple notes. I learned a lot. First of all, this is educational for me. And, Joanna, two big things you said that I think as business leaders, make the table bigger and it costs you nothing. Like, those are two really big points that I think are important to understand. Kyle, you're passionate, and I love it. And you're a whole truth teller. It's hard and it's necessary, and we won't get better without truth telling. So thank you for that, just right out of the gate. Kimberly, you hit me right in the head out of the gate with, we're still having all these firsts. And, yeah, We are, and we can't change the fact we haven't, but we can only keep going forward. So, Mike, I had a couple notes, but I just changed mine at the very end. Is make it personal. That was just simple and true, and we'd all be better businesses if we all make it personal. Lisa, your brand is iconic, and hello, neighbor. Your brand's iconic, and the fact that the story and the evolution of the change you've had to go through, and the commitment that you as an individual leader have made through that, and I know your team's with you, is a lesson for all of us as entrepreneurs, as businesses, you can make these big changes and be successful. Alan, you win coolest background with the fish tank. That's awesome. I love it. And you said it first, and it's a human issue. It's not a black issue. It's not a brown issue. It's not a white issue. It's a human issue. And I think if we all start from there, the world's a better place pretty quickly. So thank you. I learned a lot. I know that I'll be a better leader and contributor to society because of this session, and I'm grateful. So that's all I have to say, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.